Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to be stepping back in time. We're going to explore the moderate phase of the Indian National Congress.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, we'll try to unravel their strategies, right, how they worked, and their lasting impact on India's journey to independence. You know, this deep dive, I think, is perfect for anyone who's just curious about Indian history, especially those gearing up for the UPSC exams,
Right, right.
And hey, before we really get going, don't forget to, hit that like button
Of course, of course.
and subscribe to our channel for more, insightful deep dives.
More deep dives.
Yeah, make sure you click the bell icon so you don't miss any episodes.
Very important.
All right, so imagine India in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. British rule, it's, firmly established.
Yeah.
But there's this new sense of nationalism bubbling up.
That's an interesting time.
Yeah, that's where the Indian National Congress, or INC, enters the scene. It was formed in 1885.
Right.
Now, during this initial phase, they adopted a kind of moderate approach.
Moderate.
Yeah,
Oh.
so think petitions, respectful dialogue,
Okay.
a belief in gradual reform. But don't mistake moderate for passive.
Mm-hmm.
These leaders, they were laying the groundwork for India's future.
Yeah, it's fascinating how these early leaders like Dadabhai Naoroji, Gopal Krishna Gokhale, for Uruzisha Mehta,
Yeah, big names.
they operated within the British system. They genuinely believed in its fairness, I think. Their strategy was to present well-reasoned arguments, expose the struggles of Indians under British rule, and trust that the British government would respond with reforms.
So almost like they were playing this long game, relying on the goodwill of the British.
Yeah.
But they weren't just sitting around waiting, right? They had specific demands. They were pushing for change.
Absolutely. They weren't afraid to pinpoint what needed to change. One of their key demands was expanding the legislative councils to give Indians more of a voice in governance. But their approach went beyond just politics, They also meticulously documented the economic drain that India was experiencing under British rule.
So they weren't just politely asking for representation. They were exposing the economic inequalities of British rule.
Exactly. They coined the term drain theory to explain how India's resources were being siphoned off.
Drain theory.
Yeah, enriching Britain at India's expense. Think of it like this. It's a bit like, how we talk about resource extraction or unequal trade deals today,
Okay.
where one side benefits disproportionately. The strain theory, I think, it resonated deeply with the Indian public and really fueled the nationalist sentiment.
Yeah, this drain theory, it seems like a powerful tool to sway public opinion. Did it lead to any concrete changes?
Well, it certainly put pressure on the British.
Okay.
They did enact the Indian Councils Act of 1892, but many saw it as a half measure,
Really?
Yeah, the real significance of the moderates' work lies in shaping public opinion, I think. They fostered a sense of national unity and laid the intellectual foundation for the more assertive nationalist movements that would follow.
So beyond pushing for these specific reforms, they were really changing the conversation, planting the seeds for a larger movement.
Yes.
It seems like they were incredibly active.
Yeah.
Organizing, publishing, even sending delegations to Britain.
Oh, yeah.
But was this strategy of respectful dialogue and petitions actually effective?
That's a great question, and it's one that historians still debate, really. While their efforts did yield some results, like the Indian Councils Act of 1892, which did expand those legislative councils,
Right.
many felt it didn't go far enough. The moderates were operating within a system that was inherently designed to maintain British control.
I see.
But their real impact lies in their long-term vision, I think.
Okay.
They nurtured a generation of leaders who would later adopt more assertive strategies.
So in a way, they were playing the long game, understanding that systemic change takes time and strategic planning. It's interesting how they were willing to work within the system, even while criticizing it. But I'm curious, did this approach ever create tensions within the Congress itself? Were there those who felt a more assertive approach was needed?
You're absolutely right to point that out. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a new generation of leaders began to emerge within the Congress.
Okay.
They felt that the moderate strategy, while it laid important groundwork,
Yeah.
it was ultimately too slow and too reliant on British goodwill.
I see.
They became known as the extremists or, radicals, and they advocated for a more assertive approach to achieving independence.
So while the moderates were focused on dialogue and reform,
Right.
the extremists were ready to take a more active role in shaping India's destiny. What were some of the key figures in this extremist movement?
Yeah, the extremist movement was spearheaded by powerful leaders like Bal Gangadhar Tilak, Lala Lajpat Rai, and Bipin Chandra Pal.
Okay,
You'll often hear them referred to as the Lal Bal Pal Trio.
got it.
These figures argued that true freedom could only come from self-reliance.
Hmm?
They championed the concept of Swadeshi, which translates to self-sufficiency or self-governance.
Swadeshi. It's a concept we hear a lot about in Indian history.
Right.
What exactly did it look like in practice?
Swadeshi went beyond just political rhetoric. It was a call to action.
Huh?
The extremists urged Indians to boycott British goods and instead promote indigenous industries.
Interesting.
They believed that by strengthening India's own economic base, they could weaken British control and foster a sense of national pride.
Oh.
Imagine the impact of millions of Indians choosing to buy Indian-made products instead of those imported from Britain.
That's a powerful image. A nation choosing to invest in its own future, its own industries, its own people.
Exactly.
It sounds like a direct challenge to British economic interests in India.
It absolutely was.
Wow.
The extremists understood that economic power could be a lever for political change,
Right.
and their message resonated with the public. The boycott movement gained momentum, and British businesses in India began to feel the pinch.
But wasn't it difficult to get people to give up familiar British goods? Were Indian industries really able to meet the demand?
It certainly wasn't easy. British goods were often perceived as superior in quality, and they were readily available.
Right.
The extremists had to work hard to persuade people to embrace Swadeshi.
Okay.
And they did so by framing it as a patriotic act,
I see.
a way to demonstrate their commitment to a free India.
Hmm.
They also worked to revitalize Indian industries and promote local craftsmanship.
So they weren't just boycotting, they were building something new.
Exactly.
It sounds like they were tapping into a deeper sentiment,
Yeah.
a sense of national pride that transcended individual choices. This must have been a turning point in the nationalist movement.
It was indeed. The rise of the extremists marked a shift towards a more assertive and confrontational approach to achieving independence.
Okay.
They challenged the moderates' faith in the British system and argued that India needed to assert its own identity and its right to self-determination. This inevitably led to some friction within the Congress itself.
So the Congress was now facing a dilemma stick with the moderates' strategy of gradual reform or embrace the extremists' call for more radical action.
Exactly. The Congress was essentially caught between these two poles, reflecting the growing tensions within Indian society itself.
I see.
Some believed that the moderates' approach was too accommodating to the British,
Oh.
while others feared that the extremists' strategy could lead to violence and repression. This internal debate ultimately culminated in a split within the Congress in 1907 when the extremists were expelled from the party.
Wow, so the differences between the moderates and the extremists were significant enough to break apart the Congress. What were the core ideological differences that drove this split?
It boils down to their fundamental views on British rule and the best path to achieving Swaraj.
Swaraj, yeah.
The moderates believed that India could achieve self-governance through gradual reforms, working within the existing system,
Correct.
appealing to British justice and fairness. They envisioned a future where India would have greater autonomy while remaining part of the British Empire.
I see.
The extremists, however, saw British rule as inherently exploitative and believed that true freedom could only be achieved through complete independence. They rejected the idea of appealing to British goodwill and advocated for more assertive tactics like boycotts, strikes, and non-cooperation.
So it wasn't just a difference in tactics.
Yeah.
It was a fundamental difference in their vision for India's future.
Right.
The moderates saw a future within the British Empire, while the extremists demanded complete independence.
You've hit the nail on the head.
Wow.
And this split within the Congress reflects a larger debate happening across the colonized world at the time.
Okay.
How do you achieve independence from a powerful empire? What strategies are most effective? What sacrifices are you willing to make? These were questions that resonated not just in India, but in countless other nations striving for self-determination.
It's incredible how these debates from over a century ago still resonate with struggles for freedom and self-determination happening today.
It is.
The split within the Congress must have had a profound impact on the trajectory of the nationalist movement.
It did.
Did the extremists' approach, which seemed more confrontational, involve violence?
It's important to note that while the extremists were certainly more assertive in their approach, They largely advocated for nonviolent resistance.
Okay.
They understood that violence would be counterproductive and could give the British a justification for further repression.
So their emphasis was on mobilizing the masses through nonviolent means, using boycotts, protests, and other forms of civil disobedience to challenge British rule.
Exactly.
But if they weren't advocating for violence, why were they labeled as extremists?
The term extremist, especially in the context of early 20th century India, is complex.
Yeah.
It was often used by the British to delegitimize any movement or leader that challenged their authority in a way they perceived as radical or threatening.
Right.
Remember, from the British perspective, anyone advocating for complete independence from the empire was seen as extreme.
It makes you wonder, what is considered extreme? Really depends on whose perspective you're looking from.
Absolutely.
But even though they were labeled extremists,
Yeah.
their focus on Swadeshi and nonviolent resistance was incredibly impactful.
It was.
Did they achieve any concrete successes?
Well, while the extremists may not have achieved immediate political victories in terms of specific reforms,
Okay.
their impact on the nationalist movement was profound. They injected a new energy and urgency into the struggle for freedom.
Right.
They mobilized the masses on a scale never seen before.
Yeah.
And perhaps most importantly, they shifted the goalposts.
What do you mean?
Before the rise of the extremists, the focus was largely on achieving greater autonomy within the British Empire.
Okay.
But the extremists put forth a clear demand for complete independence, for Swaraj in its truest sense.
So they weren't just demanding a seat at the table. They were demanding a new table altogether. They fundamentally changed the conversation about India's future.
Exactly.
But this shift towards a more assertive approach, even if nonviolent, must have elicited a strong response from the British.
You're absolutely right. The British, facing this growing wave of nationalism and increasingly assertive demands for self-rule, responded with a combination of repression and reform.
Interesting.
On one hand, they tried to curtail the activities of both the moderates and extremists.
Yeah.
We see censorship, arrests, and attempts to stifle dissent.
Right.
But at the same time, they realized they couldn't simply ignore the rising tide of Indian nationalism.
So it was a delicate balancing act for the British.
It was.
Trying to maintain control while also making concessions to appease the growing discontent. Did this two-pronged approach work? Were they able to effectively contain the nationalist movement?
Well, history tells us that they were not. The nationalist movement, fueled by the work of both the moderates and the extremists, was becoming increasingly difficult to control. Wow.
The seeds of freedom had been sown, and a new generation of Indians was coming of age,
Right.
determined to shape their own destiny. It's fascinating to see how the British response itself, in a way, contributed to the growth of the movement. Their attempts to suppress dissent often backfired,
Right.
further fueling the flames of nationalism.
It's a classic example of how attempts to control a movement often end up strengthening it. But let's step back for a moment and consider the larger picture here.
Okay.
We've explored the moderates and the extremists, their ideologies, their strategies.
Yeah.
But what about the ordinary people? How did these movements impact their lives, their everyday experiences?
That's a crucial question, and it's one that's often overlooked in historical narratives.
Right.
The impact of these movements extended far beyond the halls of power or the pages of newspapers. Swadeshi, for example, wasn't just an abstract political concept.
Right.
It had tangible effects on people's lives.
I see.
The boycott of British goods led to the growth of local industries.
Providing new economic opportunities.
Okay.
It also fostered a sense of community and collective action as people came together to support their own businesses and artisans.
So Swadeshi wasn't just about politics.
No.
It was about reclaiming control over their economic lives,
Yeah.
their livelihoods, their very sense of self.
Exactly. And the rise of nationalist sentiment also had a profound impact on social and cultural spheres. There was a renewed interest in Indian art, literature, and music.
Interesting.
People began to question traditional social hierarchies and advocate for reforms.
I see.
Women in particular became increasingly involved in the nationalist movement,
Okay.
demanding greater rights and opportunities.
It sounds like a true awakening,
It
a
was.
national reimagining of what it meant to be Indian. But with all this ferment, all this change happening, where did the Congress go from here? The split between the moderates and extremists had left the movement fractured.
Right.
How did they move forward?
That's a great question, and it kind of leads us into a really complex period in the history of the Indian National Congress. The split between the moderates and the extremists, I mean, it left the movement fragmented, but, it also opened up new possibilities. The Congress, they had to grapple with these competing visions for India's future, trying to find a way to bridge that divide and unite the nationalist forces once again.
So the challenge now was to rebuild that unity, to find a path forward that could encompass both, right? The desire for gradual reform and the demand for complete independence. How did the Congress navigate this challenge?
Well, it wasn't a smooth or straightforward process, that's for sure. The years following the split, they were, I guess you could say, marked by internal debates, shifting alliances, and attempts to reconcile these divergent strands of nationalism. The moderates, despite their expulsion from the Congress, continued to advocate for their vision of self-rule within the British Empire. They believed that working within the system was the most pragmatic way to achieve meaningful change.
But wouldn't that have been a difficult sell after the rise of the extremists? I mean, they had so effectively challenged the idea of appealing to British goodwill.
You're absolutely right. The extremists had successfully shifted the conversation. They injected a new sense of urgency and radicalism, really, into the nationalist movement. Their emphasis on Swadeshi, on self-reliance and assertive action. It resonated deeply with the Indian public.
So the Congress had to find a way to adapt to this new reality, to this growing demand for complete independence. Did they eventually embrace the extremists' vision?
It wasn't a sudden or complete shift, more like a gradual evolution. The Congress, while still committed to constitutional means, began to adopt more assertive tactics and demands. They started to push for greater autonomy, for a larger role for Indians in the governance of their own country. And they began to articulate a vision for a future India that was not just self-governing, but fully independent.
So the extremists, even though expelled from the Congress, they had fundamentally changed the course of the nationalist movement. They, I guess, forced the Congress to reconsider its approach and embrace a more radical vision for India's future. It's fascinating how even those outside formal structures can have such a profound impact on the direction of a movement.
It is indeed. And it highlights the dynamic nature of social and political movements.
Yeah.
They are constantly evolving, responding to internal and external pressures and adapting to changing circumstances. The moderate phase, while laying the groundwork for the nationalist movement, ultimately paved the way for a more assertive and radical phase that would eventually lead to India's independence.
It's been incredible exploring this period of Indian history. We've seen how a handful of individuals, with their ideas, their strategies, their unwavering commitment, could spark a movement that would, change the course of a nation's destiny. As we wrap up our deep dive, what are some of the key takeaways you'd like our listeners to remember about the moderate phase?
I think it's crucial to recognize the moderates' role as pioneers. I mean, they were the ones who first articulated the vision of self-rule, who established the Indian National Congress as a powerful platform for nationalist aspirations. They demonstrated the power of organized political action, of reasoned argument, and persistent advocacy. And even though their approach may seem moderate in retrospect, it was quite radical for its time, really. They were challenging the very foundations of British rule, demanding a voice for Indians in the governance of their own country.
It's a reminder that progress is often incremental, that movements build upon the work of those who came before. The moderates may not have seen India achieve full independence during their time, but their contributions, they were essential to making that dream a reality.
Exactly. They laid the groundwork, they shifted the conversation, and they inspired a new generation of leaders who would carry the torch forward. Their legacy continues to shape India today, reminding us of the power of ideas, the importance of unity, and the unwavering belief in a better future.
Well said. And with that, we come to the end of our deep dive into the moderate phase of the Indian National Congress. We hope you found this exploration insightful, and maybe it sparked your curiosity to learn more about this pivotal period in Indian history. Remember, history is not just a collection of dates and events. It's more like a tapestry woven with the stories of individuals who dared to dream of a different future and who fought, in their own ways to make that dream a reality.
And who knows, maybe this deep dive will inspire you to do your own exploration, uncover those hidden stories, connect the dots between the past and the present, and find inspiration in the struggles and triumphs of those who came before us. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the spirit of curiosity alive.